The August sun had baked the Mojave sand to glass when Harold Avery stood at his ranch fence line and counted 11 sets of fresh tire tracks leading toward Dry Mercy. Each one represented trespassers who'd cut his barbed wire, driven across fragile grazing land, and set up camp in a ghost town that hadn't seen honest business since silver prices collapsed in 1903. This wasn't about property rights anymore. This was about survival in a place where water mattered more than gold, and one careless match could turn a family's livelihood into ash. The Avery Ranch occupied 1,200 acres of hardscrabble Mojave Desert, straddling the California-Nevada line where jurisdiction got fuzzy and help arrived slow. At its heart sat Dry Mercy, an abandoned mining settlement the Averys had acquired along with the grazing rights in 1947. The town was more liability than landmark, sagging wood frame buildings that shed splinters in the wind, a mine shaft protected by nothing but rotted boards and faded warning signs, a saloon where pack rats nested in what remained of the bar. The Averys grazed cattle in the sparse valley below, using Dry Mercy's old well system for watering. It was marginal land that demanded constant attention, where a single brush fire could erase years of work in an afternoon. Then, someone started a rumor about buried treasure. The story varied depending on who told it. Some versions featured a Wells Fargo strongbox hidden by robbers in 1876. Others spoke of a mine owner's personal vault, sealed before he fled creditors. The details shifted like desert sand, but the core remained. Somewhere under Dry Mercy's collapsed buildings lay fortune waiting for someone bold enough to dig. By summer of 1962, the Averys were finding fresh campsites every weekend. City folks with metal detectors and dreams, college students on adventure, would-be prospectors who'd watched too many westerns and thought striking it rich meant nothing more than showing up with a shovel. Before we go deeper into what happened in that ghost town, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried under desert sand for over 60 years. The Averys weren't cruel people by nature. Harold and his wife Martha had raised 3 sons on that ranch, Thomas, Dale, and young Pete, teaching them the desert's harsh mathematics. Water was measured in gallons, not taken for granted. Fences kept livestock alive, not just contained. Fire was always one spark away from catastrophe. The treasure hunters didn't understand these equations. They cut fences, letting cattle wander onto highway shoulders where semi-trucks didn't brake for animals. They drained the stock tanks dry, washing dusty faces while Avery cows stood in punishing sun. They built campfires using century-old building timber, never considering what might happen when desert wind kicked up. On July 14, 1962, it finally happened. A group of prospectors from Los Angeles had set up camp inside Dry Mercy's old jailhouse, using its 3 remaining walls as windbreak. They'd cooked dinner over an open fire, then left embers burning while they hiked up to examine the mine shaft by moonlight. The wind shifted around 10 p.m., carrying sparks into dried sage and creosote bush. By the time Harold spotted the orange glow from his ranch house 3 miles away, 40 acres were already burning, racing toward the only green valley the Averys had, where summer feed grew and cattle could survive the worst heat. The volunteer fire department from SEMA took 2 hours to arrive. Harold, Martha, and their sons fought the blaze with shovels and wet burlap, trying to cut fire breaks while smoke choked their lungs and heat blistered exposed skin. The fire stopped 50 yards from the valley, killed by a shift in wind and sheer luck. When the sun rose over blackened desert, Harold Avery stood looking at the destruction and made a decision that would define his family's legacy. The treasure hunters had to become a resource, not a nuisance. What would you do, watching your life's work nearly burn because strangers treated your land like a playground? The Averys had tried reasoning, tried posting signs, tried calling the sheriff, who'd shrugged and said enforcing trespassing laws on abandoned ghost towns wasn't high priority when real crimes needed attention. Legal remedies moved slow in the Mojave. The desert demanded faster solutions. Thomas Avery, the eldest son at 29, had always been the planner. He'd studied surveying at community college before drought economics forced him back to ranching. He understood maps, property lines, and how people thought about treasure. Over breakfast 3 days after the fire, while the family ate in silence and studied smoke-stained walls, Thomas spoke the quiet words that would seal 11 people's fate. What if we gave them exactly what they're looking for? His mother, Martha, stopped mid-bite. His father, Harold, set down his coffee cup with the careful precision of someone considering something terrible. Dale and Pete exchanged glances, waiting. Not real treasure, Thomas continued. A map, a perfect treasure map that leads right where we want them to go. The machinery had already started turning. The family had no way of knowing that within 6 weeks, Dry Mercy would earn a new kind of silence, the kind that comes when screaming finally stops and desert sand swallows secrets. They couldn't predict how the August heat would carry sounds farther than they'd planned, or how long human voices could echo in confined spaces before breaking into something less than human. They only knew the treasure hunters kept coming, kept destroying, kept threatening everything the Averys had built in an unforgiving place. And sometimes, in the desert, survival requires burying what threatens you before it buries you first. Martha Avery's hands, calloused from decades of ranch work, traced careful lines across aged parchment she'd tea-stained in her kitchen sink. The paper curled at the edges where she'd burned it with a cigarette lighter, adding authenticity through controlled destruction. This wasn't impulsive violence. This was engineering disguised as treasure hunting mythology. And every detail mattered, because 11 lives would depend on believing the lie. The map had to be perfect enough to be believed, but crude enough to seem real. Thomas handled the drafting, using surveying skills to create a layout of Dry Mercy that matched actual building positions while introducing strategic errors, the kind a fleeing outlaw might make while sketching from memory in 1876. He placed the X with surgical precision, center of Main Street, directly above what had once been the town's primary water source. The Averys knew that spot intimately. They'd used it for cattle watering until 1958, when the well ran dry and they'd capped it with rotting boards and a layer of sand. What the map didn't show was what Thomas had done 3 nights after the fire, widening that well shaft with borrowed excavation equipment, removing the ladder rungs, smoothing the walls until they offered no purchase for climbing fingers. The well now measured 8 feet across and dropped 30 feet straight down to a floor of packed sand and rock, deep enough to muffle sound, wide enough to hold multiple people, narrow enough that collapsing the opening would trap everything below. Dale contributed the aging process, having learned theatrical techniques during a brief stint with a Barstow community theater. He knew how ink oxidized, how paper yellowed, how fold lines weakened over decades. The map received coffee stains in strategic locations, was folded and refolded until creases threatened to split, then stored in Martha's oven at low heat for 6 hours to accelerate deterioration. The final touch came from Harold's oldest trunk, genuine 1870s newspapers that Dale carefully tore and arranged around the map, creating the illusion of discovery among authentic artifacts. Who finds it matters as much as what they find, Thomas said, watching his mother seal the map in wax paper aged with barn dust. They needed someone connected to the treasure hunting community, but not too connected. Someone who'd spread word organically, through swap meets and prospecting clubs without institutional scrutiny. Someone who'd never traced the information back to the Averys. They found him at the Yermo swap meet on a Saturday in late July. The desert air shimmered above acres of folding tables where vendors sold everything from Depression-era glass to mining equipment that hadn't worked in 50 years. The scent of hot metal, mixed with funnel cake grease and sweat-soaked canvas. Thomas walked the aisles slowly, listening to conversations, identifying his target through patience and observation. He found what he needed at table 47, a man in his 50s selling genuine antique maps alongside obvious forgeries, his weathered face suggesting someone who'd spent years chasing desert dreams and finding only sunburns and disappointment. His name was Leonard Cobb, and he talked about the Dry Mercy legend without prompting. "You hear about that ghost town past Sema?" Cobb asked a customer examining a topographical map. "They say Jesse James's cousin hid strongbox money there after a Tucson job, worth $50,000 in gold coin. I've been out there twice looking, but you need the right map, the real map, not these tourist versions." Thomas listened for another 20 minutes, learning Cobb's patterns, his network, his credibility within prospecting circles. Then he waited 2 weeks, letting the trail grow cold between observation and action. The desert teaches patience. On August 11, 1962, Martha Avery drove alone to Yermo, parked 3 blocks from the swap meet, and approached Cobb's table with the careful uncertainty of someone who didn't quite know what she had. She wore her town clothes, the simple dress she saved for church, and carried the map in a cardboard box padded with those genuine 1870s newspapers. "My husband's grandfather passed," Martha explained, setting the box on Cobb's table with rehearsed hesitation. "We're cleaning out his things. Found this old trunk and there's papers. I don't know if they're worth anything, but someone said you'd know." Cobb's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the map. Thomas had predicted this, the treasure hunter's tell, the involuntary response to finding something that might finally be real. Martha watched his pupils dilate, his breathing quicken, the way his fingers traced the X with something approaching reverence. "Where exactly was this trunk?" Cobb asked, voice carefully neutral despite obvious excitement. "Mojave, ranch property my husband's family has owned since the 20s. The trunk was in a barn, way back under some collapsed shelving." Martha glanced around nervously, playing her part. "Is it valuable? We could use the money if someone collects old maps." Cobb offered her $200. Martha hesitated, then accepted with the grateful surprise of someone who thought she'd found 20. She left the swap meet without looking back, knowing Cobb would study that map for hours, verify the locations against his own research, convince himself he'd discovered the key to Dry Mercy's buried fortune through sharp trading rather than elaborate manipulation. The trap was baited and armed. Within 3 days, Cobb had shared the map with his prospecting club, a loose network of weekend treasure hunters who met monthly at a Barstow diner to exchange rumors and techniques. The Averys learned this through their own careful intelligence gathering. Pete, the youngest son, had befriended a club member's daughter who mentioned her father's excitement about a real lead on the Dry Mercy strongbox. The network was spreading the information exactly as Thomas had calculated, person to person, building credibility through word of mouth rather than any traceable advertisement. On August 19, 1962, the Avery family gathered at their ranch house and reviewed final preparations. The well opening had been camouflaged with boards deliberately weakened at calculated stress points. They'd positioned 3 derelict vehicles, a 1948 Ford pickup, a stripped Chevy sedan, and a flatbed missing its engine, near Main Street, claiming they planned to salvage parts. The vehicles weighed enough to seal the well permanently once rolled into position. Harold opened a bottle of whiskey that night, something he rarely did. The family sat on the porch as darkness swallowed the desert and stars emerged like witness points. Nobody spoke about what they were planning. Nobody questioned whether 11 lives were worth defending 1,200 acres of marginal grazing land. The desert had already taught them that survival wasn't about morality, it was about mathematics. Thomas checked his watch. 9:47 p.m. "Cobb's club is meeting tomorrow night," he said quietly. "He'll pitch the expedition then. Figure they'll plan for next weekend, maybe the one after. We've got time to change our minds." But they all knew the decision was already made, set in motion the moment Martha's hands began drawing false treasure on aged paper. You couldn't unbait a trap once rumors started spreading. You couldn't unwiden a well shaft or unweaken boards that would collapse under precisely calculated weight. The machinery was already in motion, grinding toward an August night when 11 people would follow a beautiful lie straight down into darkness, and the desert would swallow their screams like it swallowed everything else. Rain, hope, evidence. Leonard Cobb stood before 23 prospectors in the back room of Betty's Diner on August 21, 1962, and unfolded the map that would kill nearly half of them. The air conditioning wheezed against Mojave heat, seeping through single-pane windows, mixing cigarette smoke with the ghost of fried onions and desperation, because everyone in that room had chased fool's gold before and knew the odds, but couldn't stop gambling anyway. This gathering represented the last moment when 11 people could have chosen to stay alive, made different decisions, trusted their instincts over their greed. But treasure hunting attracts believers, not skeptics, and Cobb was selling certainty in a world that rarely offered any. This is the real article. Cobb announced, weighing the map with reverence. "Authenticated papers, legitimate provenance. I traced the seller, rancher family, third generation, grandfather's trunk. They don't even know what they had." He spread the aged parchment across a table, sticky with decades of spilled coffee. "The X marks Main Street in Dry Mercy, and I've been there enough times to know this layout is accurate. 1876 era matches the Jesse James timeline perfectly." The gathered prospectors leaned in, squinting at faded ink and careful notations. These weren't professional criminals or hardened outlaws. They were welders and postal workers and grocery clerks who spent their weekends with metal detectors, chasing the same American mythology that had populated California during the gold rush. Most had families waiting at home. Several had vacation days saved specifically for moments like this. Frank Delgado, a mechanic from Victorville, raised the first practical question. "Who owns that land now? We can't just dig up someone's property without permission." "It's abandoned," Cobb assured him, which was technically true. Dry Mercy itself had no legal inhabitants. What he didn't mention, because Martha Avery had been careful not to mention, was that the ghost town sat squarely on active ranch property with owners who very much cared about trespassers. "We go in after dark, work fast, get out before anyone notices, in and out in 6 hours, maximum." The plan coalesced through group consensus, the way bad decisions often do when everyone wants to believe. They'd convoy out on August 25th, a Saturday night when darkness provided cover and weekend schedules allowed participation. Each member would bring specific equipment: ropes, harnesses, flashlights, excavation tools, burlap bags for transporting whatever they found. Cobb estimated the strongbox would be buried 10 to 20 feet down, requiring careful excavation, but nothing they couldn't handle with proper preparation. 11 people volunteered for the core team. Others declined, citing family obligations or work commitments or a vague unease they couldn't articulate. Those who said no would spend years wondering if instinct had saved them, or if they'd simply missed history's only genuine treasure map. From the San Bernardino County Sheriff's log, August 26, 1962. Received report of suspicious vehicle activity near Sema area, approximately 2 a.m. No units available for patrol. Logged for follow-up. The convoy left Barstow at 8:30 p.m. on August 25th, 11 vehicles carrying 11 treasure hunters plus Cobb's leadership. They drove east on Route 66 before turning north onto dirt roads that most maps didn't acknowledge, following hand-drawn directions Cobb had prepared from the treasure map's layout. The desert at night transforms into something ancient and indifferent, cooling sand releasing the day's stored heat. Darkness so complete it feels physical, stars bright enough to cast shadows. Frank Delgado drove his 1957 Chevy pickup, his wife's last words still echoing, "Promise me you'll be careful." He'd promised, the way people always promise before doing dangerous things, never imagining careful wouldn't matter once boards collapsed beneath calculated weight. Behind him came Roger Kinsey, a postal worker who'd spent 3 years researching Dry Mercy's history, convinced the town held secrets beyond simple silver mining. His teenage daughter had asked to come along. He'd refused, thank God, though that small mercy would haunt him in ways refusing couldn't prevent. The convoy also included James and Patricia Holloway, married prospectors who'd met at a geology convention and bonded over shared obsession with lost treasures. 2 brothers, Carl and Dennis Wright, who ran a construction company and brought professional excavation equipment. A college student named Michael Torres, 22 years old, chasing adventure before graduate school started in September. An elderly man, everyone called Pops, real name Walter Simmons, who claimed to have met Jesse James's cousin in 1909 and swore the strongbox story was legitimate. Others whose names would appear in missing persons reports: Thomas Chen, Barbara Yates, Helen Kowalski. 11 lives with families, histories, futures. The headlights cut through darkness until Dry Mercy emerged like a fever dream. Skeletal buildings leaning at angles that defied physics, empty windows reflecting starlight like dead eyes. Main Street nothing but packed sand between structures slowly dissolving back into desert. The prospectors killed their engines 200 yards out, approaching the final distance on foot to avoid drawing attention. Flashlight beams swept across abandoned storefronts and the old saloon, where pack rats scattered at the intrusion. There, Cobb whispered, pointing to the X's location. Center of Main Street, marked by nothing except slightly depressed sand that might indicate disturbed ground beneath. The boards covering the well opening had been carefully camouflaged with decades of accumulated dust and debris, looking like nothing more than random wood scraps half buried by time. The treasure hunters gathered around their destination, 11 people standing at the threshold of discovery and death, unable to distinguish between the two. Equipment was distributed, ropes secured to nearby building supports, harnesses checked and double-checked, flashlights tested. The plan was simple. Cobb would descend first, assess the excavation requirements, then signal for others to follow with tools. Nobody questioned why an 1876 outlaw would bury a strongbox beneath the town's main thoroughfare, where foot traffic and wagon wheels might disturb the hiding place. Nobody wondered why the map showed such precise coordinates when fleeing criminals rarely measured property lines. Treasure hunters see what they want to see, believing becomes easier than questioning. At 11:47 p.m., Leonard Cobb tested the boards with his weight, finding them surprisingly solid. He stepped fully onto the wooden platform, adjusting his harness while others held the rope taut. The boards held. Cobb gave a thumbs up, then positioned himself above the gap between planks where the vault entrance supposedly waited. "Lower me down slow," he instructed. "Keep tension on the rope." What Cobb couldn't know, what none of them could know, was that the Avery family had positioned themselves in darkness beyond Dry Mercy's perimeter, watching through binoculars as flashlight beams moved through their carefully constructed kill zone. Harold, Martha, Thomas, Dale, and Pete stood in silence, waiting for the precise moment when gravity and greed would intersect. Thomas held a stopwatch, counting seconds until commitment became irreversible. The boards began to crack. The first crack sounded like a gunshot in the desert silence, sharp wood fracturing under Leonard Cobb's 210 pounds, distributed across planks engineered to fail at precisely that threshold. In the half-second before physics claimed him, Cobb's face registered not fear but confusion, the expression of someone realizing the map lied but having no time left to process what that meant. The collapse didn't happen instantly, which made it worse. Boards splintering in sequence as weight shifted, other treasure hunters scrambling backward while Cobb plunged through widening darkness, his scream Dopplering down 30 feet of shaft that swallowed sound like water swallows stones. The rope burned through Frank Delgado's gloved hands as Cobb's falling weight jerked the line taut. Frank held for 3 seconds, long enough to feel the sickening slack that meant Cobb had hit bottom, before the rope anchor ripped free from the rotting saloon post it had been secured to. The rope disappeared into darkness with a whisper, following its burden down into engineered oblivion. Frank stood at the edge of the collapsed opening, his flashlight beam finding only emptiness and the geometric precision of walls too smooth to be natural, too regular to be accident. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. "Jesus Christ, that's not a vault entrance." Below, Cobb screamed. Not words, just sound, the noise humans make when pain bypasses language centers and speaks directly through vocal cords. The acoustics of the well shaft amplified and distorted his voice, bouncing echoes that made one man sound like many, all of them dying at different speeds. "We need to get him out," Patricia Holloway said, her geology training providing clinical assessment even as her hands shook. "That's a well shaft, at least 25 feet. If he's injured..." "I'm going down," Frank announced, already fashioning a new harness from spare rope. "Someone find solid anchor points. We need..." The rest happened in compressed seconds that would expand in memory until they lasted lifetimes. Carl Wright, the construction worker, stepped forward to Pastotin, help secure the rope. His weight, 230 pounds, found the perimeter boards that hadn't yet collapsed. The engineering tolerances Thomas Avery had calculated proved grimly accurate. The remaining platform gave way in a cascading failure, boards snapping concentrically inward like a closing mouth. Carl plunged through, grabbing reflexively for purchase and catching his brother Dennis's arm. Both men disappeared into darkness, their combined weight pulling Roger Kinsey off balance as he tried to help. Roger's flashlight spun away, its beam creating a strobe effect as it tumbled, illuminating surprised faces, then darkness, then the well's stone walls, then nothing. 4 people in the hole within 10 seconds. The treasure hunters who'd stood back, Pop Simmons, Michael Torres, Barbara Yates, Helen Kowalski, the Holloways, froze in collective horror, their flashlight beams converging on an opening now 12 feet across where boards had been. The smooth walls Thomas had spent 3 nights preparing offered no handholds, no friction, no mercy. From below came a symphony of impact sounds, bodies hitting sand, bones breaking, grown men sobbing, and beneath it all, Leonard Cobb still screaming, now joined by a chorus. "Back up," Thomas Holloway commanded, his voice cracking. "Everyone back from the edge before—" He didn't finish. The ground beneath their feet had been undermined by decades of water erosion, then deliberately weakened by Avery excavation work. The weight of 7 people standing near the well's new perimeter proved exactly enough to trigger the final collapse Thomas had designed. The edge gave way like crumbling cake, and gravity claimed its mathematics. 11 seconds after the first board cracked, all 11 treasure hunters were in the hole. The desert swallowed their screams. From where the Averys watched, binoculars pressed to faces that showed no expression, the collapse looked almost graceful, a choreographed surrender to forces they'd calculated with surveying precision. Thomas clicked his stopwatch. 11 seconds from first fracture to complete containment, better than the 15 seconds he'd projected. "Now," Harold Avery said quietly. The family moved with practiced coordination, approaching Dry Mercy from different angles to avoid leaving concentrated tire tracks. They'd rehearsed this part 3 times, timing each step, eliminating wasted motion. The 3 derelict vehicles they'd positioned near Main Street stood ready: Harold's 1948 Ford pickup, the stripped Chevy sedan, and the engineless flatbed. Each vehicle sat in carefully calculated position, requiring minimal force to roll directly over the collapsed well opening. The screaming from below intensified as flashlight beams swept overhead, treasure hunters suddenly understanding that their collapse wasn't accident, but design. Voices shouted for help, pleaded for mercy, tried to negotiate with darkness. Several voices called out specific names, wives, children, parents, as if speaking them might conjure rescue. The first vehicle rolled at 12:03 a.m. Harold and Thomas pushed the Ford together, Dale providing steering until momentum carried it over the well opening. 2 tons of rusted metal crashed onto weakened boards and sand, dropping 3 feet into the shaft before wedging against walls, creating a partial seal that cut off moonlight and muffled sound. The second vehicle went easier. Martha drove the Chevy sedan to the edge while her sons guided it into position, then released the brake. The car's nose dropped into the opening at an angle, frame grinding against stone walls, settling with a metallic groan that harmonized sickeningly with human voices beneath. Patricia Holloway's geology training served her one final time in those last seconds before the third vehicle erased any possibility of light or rescue. She recognized the acoustic change, understood what metal scraping stone meant, and screamed a warning to those trapped below. "They're sealing us in! Someone's sealing us!" The flatbed silenced her. 3 vehicles wedged into an opening meant for one created a plug that no amount of human strength could shift from below. The Averys worked quickly, shoveling sand and gravel into remaining gaps, packing the makeshift tomb with desert material that would blend seamlessly into Dry Mercy's landscape within weeks. They used boards salvaged from collapsed buildings to create a surface layer, then scattered decades' worth of accumulated debris across the site: rusted cans, broken glass, splintered wood, the archaeological signature of a ghost town slowly erasing itself. By 2:15 a.m., Main Street looked undisturbed, except for tire tracks the wind would smooth by morning. The screaming had diminished to muffled sounds, voices abraded raw, oxygen growing thin in sealed space, desperation giving way to the exhausted mathematics of carbon dioxide poisoning. The Averys stood in silence, listening to what they'd done, calculating whether they'd left any evidence that would connect them to whatever investigation might eventually come. "We should go," Dale finally said, his voice flat with shock at what planning looked like in execution. They drove home in separate vehicles, taking different routes, establishing alibis through geographic separation. In 6 hours, they'd murdered 11 people and transformed Dry Mercy from liability to solution. The treasure hunters who'd threatened their ranch with carelessness and fire had become the resource Thomas predicted. buried fertilizer for a family secret that would keep other trespassers away through rumor and fear. Once word spread that Dry Mercy claimed those who came seeking fortune. But rumors require witnesses, and they'd sealed all 11 below ground. What the Averys hadn't calculated was how long 11 people could survive in 30 feet of darkness before thirst and suffocation completed what gravity had started, or how far sound could travel through desert silence when wind stopped blowing and the only noise was human suffering refusing to stop. Dawn broke over the Mojave on August 26, 1962, painting the sky colors that 11 people would never see again. Rose gold bleeding into turquoise, the daily resurrection of light that made the desert beautiful for those with enough air to appreciate it. Inside the sealed well shaft beneath 3 vehicles and 6 feet of packed sand, the mathematics of death had become simple arithmetic. 11 people, finite oxygen, time measured in increasingly desperate breaths. The Avery family ate breakfast in silence that morning, forks scraping plates with sounds that seemed too loud, coffee cups set down with excessive care, nobody meeting anyone's eyes because looking at each other meant acknowledging what they'd done together and could never undo separately. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he buttered toast. Martha stared at her eggs until they went cold. Pete, the youngest at 19, excused himself twice to vomit in the bathroom, his body rejecting what his mind had agreed to in planning but couldn't process in execution. "We did what we had to," Thomas said finally, breaking the silence with words that sounded like prayer and excuse in equal measure. "The fire almost killed us. They wouldn't stop coming. We had no choice." But everyone at that table knew choice had existed at multiple points before drawing the map, before spreading the rumor, before weakening the boards, before rolling vehicles over human beings who'd come seeking treasure and found only 30 feet of engineered darkness. They'd chosen this deliberately, calculated it carefully, and now had to survive what survival required. By 9 a.m., phones started ringing in Victorville, Barstow, San Bernardino. Families expecting returning treasure hunters, wives wondering why husbands hadn't called, parents confused by children who'd promised to check in but hadn't. Frank Delgado's wife contacted authorities at 10:47 a.m., explaining her husband had gone prospecting near Sema and should have returned by dawn. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department logged the report with the practiced indifference of agencies that handled dozens of missing outdoorsmen monthly in desert territory, where people regularly overestimated their survival skills and underestimated the Mojave's hostility. The first deputy didn't reach Dry Mercy until late afternoon, following vague directions from Frank's wife about an old ghost town near Sema where there's supposed to be treasure. Deputy Carl Morrison found the abandoned settlement exactly as it had looked for 60 years. Sagging buildings, sand-drifted streets, no signs of recent activity beyond the tire tracks that could have been days or weeks old in a place where wind erased evidence hourly. He walked Main Street calling names, his voice absorbed by emptiness and heat shimmer. He looked inside buildings, checked the old mine shaft, examined the well area where 3 derelict vehicles sat rusting into oblivion like they'd been there forever. Morrison filed his report. Searched Dry Mercy ghost town thoroughly. No signs of missing persons, no evidence of recent camping or excavation. Recommend expanding search to wider Mojave area. Beneath his boots as he walked Main Street, 11 people were dying by degrees. The human body can survive approximately 3 days without water, less in desert heat that turns sealed spaces into ovens even underground. The trapped treasure hunters had perhaps 48 hours of consciousness before dehydration shut down organs in sequence. Kidneys failing, blood thickening, hallucinations replacing rational thought. But oxygen depletion would claim them faster. 11 people sealed in roughly 600 cubic feet of space, sharing air that wouldn't regenerate, each breath converting oxygen to carbon dioxide in an equation that ended the same way, regardless of how carefully anyone rationed breathing. Some died from injuries sustained in the fall. Carl Wright had broken his back, his brother Dennis holding him through hours of paralyzed agony. Roger Kinsey fractured his skull against the well's stone bottom, bleeding internally, drifting in and out of consciousness while others screamed at the sealed opening above. But most died slowly, aware of every second, feeling their bodies shut down in the hierarchy of biological failure. Leonard Cobb, the man who'd believed the map and spread its lie, survived longest, positioned near a small gap between vehicles where marginally fresher air leaked through. He used his final hours scratching messages into the well's stone walls with a belt buckle, leaving evidence that no one would find for 60 years. His last words, carved into rock while his hands still worked, "The Averys knew." Desert silence holds secrets perfectly. The screaming had stopped by Monday morning. The Averys went about their daily ranch work, mending fences, moving cattle, performing the mundane tasks that proved normalcy to anyone watching. When Deputy Morrison stopped by the ranch house on August 28th, asking if they'd seen prospectors or suspicious vehicles, Harold Avery answered with the careful truth that made the best lies. "We get treasure hunters sometimes," Harold admitted, leaning against his porch rail with the easy confidence of someone who owned the land in the conversation. "Usually they camp at Dry Mercy for a night, dig around, don't find anything, leave. Haven't noticed anyone specific lately, but we don't monitor that old town closely. It's 3 miles from our house." Morrison accepted this, noting the Averys' cooperation and apparent ignorance. He drove back to San Bernardino with nothing actionable, recommending the search expand to highways and known prospecting sites where treasure hunters might have gotten lost or injured. The missing persons cases remained open, but cold, 11 families entering that terrible limbo between hope and grief, waiting for news that would never clarify because bodies were buried under vehicles nobody thought to move. But the desert keeps nothing secret forever. Sound travels in unexpected ways across open spaces, especially at night when temperature inversions create acoustic channels that carry whispers for miles. On August 30th, a rancher named Sullivan, who grazed cattle 5 miles southeast of Dry Mercy, mentioned to his wife that he'd heard the damnedest sounds coming from the ghost town direction around midnight on the 25th. Voices screaming, then metal grinding, then silence that felt wrong. Sullivan's wife was sister to a San Bernardino County dispatcher. She mentioned the conversation during a phone call, the way people share curious details without understanding their weight. The dispatcher mentioned it to Morrison. Morrison remembered the missing treasure hunters and the dates that aligned too perfectly. On September 4th, 1962, a full investigation team returned to Dry Mercy with excavation equipment and warrants to search the entire ghost town thoroughly. They brought cadaver dogs, though the handlers doubted effectiveness in heat that baked scent molecules into uselessness. They brought metal detectors, though every building held enough rusty nails to make the equipment scream constantly. They brought questions that would remain unanswered for decades. What they didn't bring was any reason to move 3 derelict vehicles that looked exactly like abandoned junk in a town full of abandoned junk, positioned on Main Street, where vehicles might have broken down 60 years ago or 6 months ago. Impossible to distinguish in a place where time collapsed into entropy. The dog circled the well site 3 times and sat, indicating death beneath. The handlers interpreted this as responding to the old well itself, where countless animals had likely fallen and died over decades. Nobody suggested removing 2 tons of automotive wreckage to check beneath. The Averys watched from their ranch house, binoculars tracking investigators who came so close to truth but couldn't see it through rust and deliberate misdirection. The investigation collapsed under its own weight by mid-September, victim to bureaucratic mathematics that assigned resources based on evidence rather than instinct. And Dry Mercy offered nothing but heat shimmer and empty buildings that refused to confess. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department officially suspended active search operations on September 18, 1962, filing 11 missing persons cases that would gather dust in filing cabinets while families held memorial services for people whose bodies might be anywhere in 10,000 square miles of desert that swallowed secrets professionally. What investigators missed, what they had no framework to recognize, was the evidence hiding in plain sight at the Avery Ranch, where 4 new vehicles appeared in the yard between September and October, purchased with cash that raised no official suspicions because ranchers dealt in cash routinely, selling cattle at market and paying workers under tables that kept government paperwork minimal. The money had come from the treasure hunters themselves. In the hours after sealing the well, but before dawn made visibility dangerous, the Averys had methodically processed the victims' abandoned vehicles. 11 cars and trucks left parked beyond Dry Mercy's perimeter, keys in ignitions, personal belongings scattered across seats, wallets thick with cash that men brought on adventures they'd never return from. Thomas approached this task with the same clinical precision he'd used designing the trap, opening doors and collecting currency systematically. $640 from Frank Delgado's glove compartment, where he'd hidden treasure fund money from his wife. $900 from Leonard Cobb's briefcase, savings accumulated over 3 years of swap meat dealing. Smaller amounts from others, 20s and 50s that added to a total of $3,218 by the time the family finished counting in their kitchen at 4 a.m. Martha had vomited again, seeing her hands sort bills that still carried the warmth of wallets pressed against bodies now cooling 30 feet underground. But she kept counting, because stopping meant acknowledging what they'd become, and survival required moving forward into monstrosity rather than backward into conscience. The vehicles themselves presented a larger problem. 11 cars couldn't simply disappear without raising questions, but abandoning them near Dry Mercy would create a crime scene that even incompetent investigators couldn't ignore. The solution came from Dale, whose theatrical training extended to understanding how people saw what they expected rather than what existed. Over the next 10 days, the Averys drove the victims' vehicles away in careful sequence, never more than one per night, never following the same route, dispersing them across the Mojave like seeds planted in infertile soil. Frank Delgado's Chevy ended up outside a bar in Needles, keys on the seat suggesting a drunk driver who'd walked away and forgotten where he'd parked. The Holloway's station wagon was abandoned near a hiking trail in Joshua Tree, implying they'd gone exploring and gotten lost. Other vehicles appeared at truck stops, rest areas, side roads, each location chosen to suggest independent misfortune rather than coordinated tragedy. Investigators would eventually find most of the cars, but scattered across 3 counties with no connecting thread except missing owners, the pattern dissolved into unrelated incidents. By October 1st, the Avery ranch looked prosperous in ways it hadn't for years. Harold drove a new 1962 Ford F-250, purchased from a Barstow dealer who asked no questions about cash payment. Martha wore a winter coat that actually fit, replacing the threadbare garment she'd mended annually. Pete enrolled at community college, tuition paid in full. Thomas bought surveying equipment he'd coveted for years, professional-grade theodolite and measuring chains that transformed hobby into potential business. "Cattle market's been good to us," Harold explained to neighbors who commented on the family's sudden prosperity. "Sold that big herd to the buyer from Bakersfield, got premium price. Sometimes patience pays off." Nobody questioned this. Ranch economics were notoriously unpredictable, and a good cattle sale could transform struggling operations into comfortable ones overnight. What neighbors didn't know, what even the Averys barely acknowledged to themselves, was that the real premium came from eliminating the treasure hunters who'd threatened their operation, creating a buffer of fear that would keep other trespassers away more effectively than any fence. The mythology began organically, spreading through prospecting communities like contagion through whispered conversations and swap meat rumors. Leonard Cobb's disappearance hit hardest because he'd been connected, trusted, the kind of source people believed when he said he'd found something real. When he vanished along with an entire expedition, the story transformed from tragedy into warning. "Dry Mercy is cursed," someone said at a Barstow diner in early October, and the phrase stuck like burrs on cotton. 11 people went looking for Jesse James's gold, and the desert took them all. That ghost town doesn't want to be disturbed. The rumor evolved with each retelling, acquiring details that mixed truth and fabrication, voices heard screaming in the night, strange lights over the old mine shaft, vehicles that disappeared and reappeared miles away. The ghost town's name, Dry Mercy, became prophecy rather than description, a place where mercy had run dry for those who came seeking fortune. The Averys encouraged this mythology through careful inaction. When prospectors asked about Dry Mercy, they'd shake their heads gravely and mention the missing people, suggest the town was unstable and dangerous, hint at supernatural explanations without explicitly endorsing them. Let the desert have its legends. Let fear do the work that barbed wire couldn't. But fear also attracted attention. On October 23rd, a freelance journalist named Robert Kincaid arrived at the ranch asking questions for a piece he was writing about the Dry Mercy disappearances for a regional mystery magazine. Kincaid was young, hungry, the kind of writer who thought breakthrough stories hid in places others had searched and dismissed. "I've been reviewing the investigation reports," Kincaid explained, sitting in the Avery kitchen with coffee, Martha served in cups that had touched lips now sealed in limestone darkness. "Something doesn't add up. 11 experienced prospectors don't just vanish simultaneously. Someone knows something." Harold maintained his grandfather rancher persona, patient, helpful, slightly bewildered by tragedy. "I wish we could help. We've been on this land 30 years, and the desert takes people sometimes. Usually they turn up eventually, but 11 at once." He shook his head. "That's biblical." "Biblical," Kincaid repeated, making notes. "You believe in curses, Mr. Avery?" "I believe in people making bad decisions in dangerous places. Dry Mercy is unstable. Old mine shafts, rotted structures, wells that aren't properly capped. You go poking around at night with ropes and excitement, accidents happen." Kincaid spent 3 days investigating, interviewing neighbors, examining the ghost town, even bringing a photographer who captured Dry Mercy's photogenic decay for the magazine spread. He walked Main Street, stood exactly where 3 vehicles entombed 11 bodies, took atmospheric shots of sunset through skeletal buildings. He never thought to move the vehicles that looked like they'd been there forever. His article, published in Desert Mysteries magazine's December 1962 issue, concluded with eloquent uncertainty. "The Dry Mercy disappearances remain unexplained, a modern mystery in an ancient landscape. Perhaps the desert keeps its secrets because we're asking the wrong questions. Perhaps some treasures are buried so deep that searching becomes the real danger." The piece won a regional journalism award and solidified Dry Mercy's reputation as cursed ground. Prospecting clubs began steering members away from the ghost town, warning that whatever treasure might exist wasn't worth the risk. Trespassing on Avery land decreased by 90% over the next year. The trap had worked perfectly, not just killing the immediate threat, but creating a buffer of legend that protected the ranch more effectively than prosecution ever could. What would you have done, knowing the truth but watching a community build mythology around manufactured tragedy? The other ranchers near Dry Mercy noticed the Averys' sudden prosperity, but attributed it to good fortune rather than murder, because people see what makes sense rather than what's real. Even Deputy Morrison, who'd searched the ghost town and found nothing, accepted the official narrative. Treasure hunters got lost, died of exposure somewhere in the Mojave vastness. Bodies would maybe turn up in a few years when hikers stumbled across skeletal remains. By Christmas 1962, the Avery family gathered around a dinner table laden with food purchased with blood money, and nobody said grace. Secrets have mass, not physical weight, but gravitational pull that bends everything around them, warping relationships and conversations until even silence becomes a form of confession. By 1965, 3 years after 11 people died screaming in manufactured darkness, the Avery family had stopped talking about anything that mattered, communicating instead through careful avoidance and the kind of superficial pleasantries that people use when intimacy has become dangerous. Pete was first to crack, though his breaking happened slowly, accumulating like water damage behind walls until structural failure became inevitable. He'd been 19 when they'd rolled vehicles over human voices, young enough that his conscience hadn't yet developed the calluses older murderers grew through repetition and rationalization. He started drinking in his sophomore year of community college, bourbon in coffee thermoses during morning classes, vodka hidden in orange juice at lunch. By spring semester of 1966, he dropped out entirely, spending days in his childhood bedroom staring at ceiling cracks while the ranch demanded work he couldn't perform. Martha found him on March 14, 1966, unconscious in the barn with an empty pill bottle and a suicide note that said only, "I hear them every night. They won't stop screaming." The ambulance ride to Barstow Community Hospital took 47 minutes. Pete's stomach pumped, charcoal administered, vital signs stabilizing while doctors asked the questions families dread. How long has he been depressed? Has he attempted this before? What triggered today's crisis? Martha answered with the practiced lies that had become second nature. Stress over school, relationship problems, the pressures of ranch life. She never mentioned that her youngest son was haunted by sounds that only existed in memory and guilt, that every time wind howled through Dry Mercy's ruins, Pete heard echoes of voices they'd deliberately silenced. The psychiatric evaluation lasted 6 days. Pete was released with prescriptions for depression and anxiety, instructions to attend weekly therapy sessions, and dire warnings about alcohol interaction with medication. He followed none of this advice. Instead, he existed in the gray space between functional and suicidal, working ranch duties mechanically while parts of him remained trapped in August 1962, watching boards collapse in sequence. He needs to leave, Thomas told Harold and Martha one evening in May, discussing Pete's deterioration with clinical detachment. He's a liability. One drunk confession at the wrong bar and everything unravels. He's your brother, Martha said, but her voice carried no conviction because she'd been thinking the same thing, calculating whether maternal love outweighed survival instinct in equations that had no moral answers. They sent Pete to a cousin's ranch in Montana in June 1966, family exile disguised as therapeutic change of scenery. The cousin knew nothing about Dry Mercy, asked no questions when Pete arrived, haunted and drinking. Pete would live another 14 years in Montana before a combination of cirrhosis and deliberate neglect ended him. First victim of the era, trapped to actually die, though his death came 16 years delayed and 1,500 miles displaced from the well shaft that had claimed the others. The ranch prospered without him. By 1968, the Avery operation had expanded to 1,800 acres, purchasing adjacent properties from families who couldn't survive drought years that the Averys weathered through careful management and capital reserves built on blood money. Harold bought a proper tractor, replaced sections of fence that had needed attention for a decade, drilled a new well that actually hit water. The family photograph from that year shows 3 people, Harold, Martha, Thomas, standing in front of their ranch house with expressions that approach contentment if you don't look closely at their eyes. Dale had left in '67, telling his parents he'd gotten work with a theater company in San Francisco, but really fleeing the weight of what they'd shared. He sent Christmas cards for a few years, then stopped. The family heard through distant relatives that he'd changed his name to Daniel Ashford, married a woman who knew nothing about his past, built a life based on the foundation of never discussing where he came from or what he'd done before becoming someone else. Thomas stayed because someone had to inherit what they'd built and protected. He married in 1970, a schoolteacher from Barstow named Linda, who seemed content with her husband's silence and his reluctance to discuss family history beyond surface details. They had 2 daughters who grew up playing in the same desert where 11 people had suffocated, building sandcastles over buried secrets, innocent in ways their father could never be again. The ghost town drew curiosity seekers occasionally, despite its cursed reputation. On October 9, 1973, a group of teenagers drove out to Dry Mercy on a dare, planning to explore the ruins and prove themselves braver than urban legend suggested. They arrived at dusk with beer and bravado, parking at Main Street's edge and walking among buildings that shed shadows like skin. One boy, Jimmy Vasquez, 16, football player with college scholarship prospects, climbed onto the derelict vehicles to survey the ghost town from elevation. His weight was nothing compared to what the rusted frames had endured, but metal fatigued over 11 years of temperature extremes and molecular stress. The flatbed's frame cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. Jimmy stumbled, caught himself, climbed down carefully while his friends laughed at his panic. Nobody noticed the small gap that opened where frame met well shaft, a 6-inch space that suddenly allowed air circulation for the first time since August 1962. Nobody noticed until the smell began. Desert mummification preserves bodies differently than humid climates. Desiccation, rather than putrefaction, leathering instead of liquefaction. 11 corpses trapped and sealed. Darkness for 11 years had become something between mummy and memory, but disturbing their tomb released gases trapped in confined space, molecules of decay that had nowhere to go, suddenly finding egress. The teenagers smelled it within minutes, a sweetness gone rotten, organic material transformed by time and chemistry into something the human nose recognizes instinctively as death. They fled, convinced the ghost town's curse was real, telling stories at school on Monday about the smell of evil itself, never connecting their experience to missing persons cases from 1962. But Thomas Avery, monitoring Dry Mercy as he'd done obsessively for 11 years, noticed the teenager's visit during his evening patrol. He found the crack in the flatbed frame that night, saw the gap that threatened everything his family had built on top of buried evidence. He spent the next 3 nights working alone by moonlight, welding the frame, adding additional vehicles, a stripped Volkswagen bus and an old tractor chassis, creating layers of metal and weight that would resist disturbance for decades more. The smell dissipated within a week, absorbed back into the sand and the limestone that had become the treasure hunter's permanent address. Time passed with the desert's indifference to human tragedy. Harold died of a heart attack in 1979, collapsing while mending fence near the section where they had spread the victims' vehicles years before. His last words to Thomas, whispered in the ambulance, were, "Make sure no one ever moves those vehicles. Promise me." Thomas promised, carrying the secret forward alone because Martha had descended into dementia by 1981, her memory failing selectively. She could recall her wedding day with crystalline detail, but couldn't remember why she sometimes woke screaming about magnolia blossoms and dinner plates, images her broken mind associated with guilt she could no longer consciously access. By 1990, only Thomas remained, sole keeper of the secret, teaching his daughters about ranching and land management, but never explaining why certain sections of the property were off limits, why Dry Mercy had to remain undisturbed, why he drove out every few months to check that the vehicles covering the well hadn't shifted. "Dad's superstitious about that ghost town," his eldest daughter Sarah told friends, not knowing superstition was just another word for guilt that outlived its generation. The Mojave doesn't forget. It simply waits for erosion and time to reveal what people bury, patient as stone and twice as permanent. The drought came in 2012, the kind of 50-year event that exposes lake bottoms and reveals foundations of towns drowned by dam projects decades prior. The desert, contracting until secrets buried in generous times emerge in scarcity like bones through drought-thinned skin. The Colorado River dropped to record lows, taking the water table with it, and suddenly, the Avery Ranch, now managed by Thomas's daughter Sarah and her husband Kevin, faced a crisis that no amount of blood money could solve. The well shaft beneath Dry Mercy began to collapse from below, groundwater depletion undermining limestone that had held firm for a century until drought changed the mathematics of what stone could support. Small sinkholes appeared across the ghost town in January, then larger depressions by March. The derelict vehicles Thomas had maintained obsessively for 50 years began to shift, settling unevenly as substrate beneath them compressed and failed. Sarah called a geotechnical engineer in April 2012, worried about liability if the ghost town collapsed entirely and injured some tourist who'd ignored warnings. The engineer was a methodical woman named Dr. Rebecca Chen, who brought ground-penetrating radar and decades of experience reading what Earth tried to hide. She spent 3 days surveying Dry Mercy, her equipment painting pictures of what lay beneath sand and time. On April 19th, 2012, exactly 49 years, 7 months, and 25 days after Leonard Cobb tested boards that were engineered to fail, Dr. Chen knocked on Sarah's door with results that would unravel half a century of carefully maintained lies. "You have a significant void beneath Main Street," Chen explained, spreading printouts across the kitchen table where the Avery family had once counted blood money. Approximately 30 feet deep, roughly circular, filled with what appears to be organic material and metal debris. It's destabilizing due to groundwater loss. If those vehicles shift, the entire section could collapse catastrophically. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach, instinct whispering warnings her conscious mind couldn't yet articulate. Organic material? Could be anything. Old lumber, animal remains, vegetation. Without excavation, I can't specify. But the structural integrity is compromised. I recommend either stabilizing with concrete fill or complete excavation and documentation before. Before what? Chen glanced at her radar images, choosing words carefully. Before nature excavates it for you. Sarah found her father in the barn that evening. Thomas Avery, now 81 years old, his hands still strong from ranch work, but his eyes carrying burdens that age couldn't explain. She told him about Chen's findings, watched his face go through expressions she couldn't read. Surprise that looked practiced, concern that seemed genuine, and beneath it all, something that might have been relief. Dad, what's buried under Dry Mercy? The question hung between them like smoke from a distant fire, and Thomas understood that 50 years of silence had just reached its expiration date. He could lie, could claim ignorance, could buy time with misdirection and confusion. Or he could finally set down weight he'd carried since he was 29 years old. When he'd drawn a treasure map and calculated exactly how many pounds per square inch rotted boards could support before collapsing under human trust. 11 people, he said quietly. 11 treasure hunters who wouldn't stop coming, wouldn't stop threatening everything we'd built. We gave them what they wanted, a map to buried treasure. They followed it straight down into a well shaft we'd prepared. We sealed them in. August 1962. Sarah sat down slowly, her world restructuring around information that made too much sense. Her grandfather's deathbed insistence that certain vehicles never be moved, her father's obsessive monitoring of the ghost town, the prosperity that had sustained their ranch when neighbors failed, Uncle Pete's alcoholism and exile, Uncle Dale's disappearance into a new identity. Jesus Christ, Dad, 50 years. You've been sitting on this for 50 years? Sitting on it, building on it, prospering from it. Thomas's voice carried no emotion, exhausted beyond feeling. Everything you have came from those 11 people. The education your mother gave you, the ranch infrastructure, the land we bought during the drought in '69. All of it purchased with money we took from their vehicles after we buried them alive. The horror of it settled like dust. We have to report this, Sarah said, but her voice wavered because reporting meant destroying her family's legacy, meant criminal investigation, meant potentially implicating herself as accessory after the fact if she'd benefited from murder proceeds even unknowingly. Yes, Thomas agreed, we do. But before they could act, nature made the decision for them. On May 3, 2012, unusual rain hit the Mojave, 3 inches in 12 hours, the kind of deluge that happens once a generation. Water found every crack and fissure, flowing into the partially collapsed well shaft through gaps Thomas's welding couldn't completely seal. The added weight and pressure finished what drought had started. At 2:17 a.m., with a sound like the earth sighing, the entire Main Street section of Dry Mercy collapsed inward, taking the derelict vehicles down 30 feet in a cascading failure that registered on seismic monitors in Barstow. By dawn, Dry Mercy had a new attraction, a crater 40 feet across and 30 feet deep, exposing the well shaft the Averys had transformed into tomb, revealing bones and rotted rope and harnesses and the rusted remains of vehicles that had served as coffin lids for half a century. The rain had washed some of the sand away, exposing a skull caught in eternal scream, femurs arranged in positions that suggested people had died trying to climb over each other toward air that never came. A hiker found the scene on May 5th, called authorities with trembling voice, and suddenly, Dry Mercy hosted more law enforcement than it had seen citizens during its silver mining days. Forensic anthropologists arrived from 3 universities. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department reopened 11 missing persons cases from 1962. Cadaver dogs weren't necessary. The crater had become an open grave that told its own story in bone arrangement and belt buckles, and a wedding ring still circling the 4th metacarpal of a skeleton that had been Patricia Holloway. They found Leonard Cobb's carved messages on the well walls. The Averys knew. They sealed us in. Tell my wife I love her. The final message, etched while Cobb's hands still worked and air still existed. This was murder. Thomas Avery turned himself in on May 7, 2012, confessing to 11 counts of first-degree murder before investigators even arrived at his door. At 81, he was too old for prison to mean much. He died in county jail 8 months later, heart failure, while awaiting trial that would have been mostly symbolic. The case became national news for 3 weeks. The treasure map massacre that had remained hidden for 50 years, a family's dark secret buried under desert sand and moral compromise. Reporters descended on the Avery ranch, interviewing Sarah and Kevin, who'd known nothing but inherited everything. Ethicists debated whether you could keep wealth built on murder, whether Sarah bore responsibility for crimes committed before her birth, but funding her existence. The ranch was seized as proceeds of crime. Sarah and Kevin lost everything except the knowledge of what their family had been capable of when survival demanded monstrosity. But some things remain buried even when Earth reveals them. They never found all 11 bodies, or rather, they found 11 incomplete skeletons, bones scattered and missing in patterns that suggested something had disturbed the remains during those 50 sealed years. The forensic reports noted strange tooth marks on several femurs, damage inconsistent with human teeth, but not matching any animal that should have survived in sealed darkness. One anthropologist quietly suggested cannibalism, desperation driving the last conscious survivors to unthinkable acts, but no one wanted to investigate what the final hours in that well had looked like, what 11 people did to each other when hope died and only animal survival remained. Even today, locals claim Dry Mercy is genuinely cursed, that the collapse in 2012 wasn't geological but supernatural, the desert finally vomiting up evil it could no longer digest. Some nights, when wind moves through the crater where Main Street used to be, people swear they hear voices calling for help that will never arrive, treasure hunters still searching for fortune that was always fiction. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.